It was a chilly Thursday night when Dylan found the flyer. It had been shoved under the windshield wiper of his old sedan, just another piece of junk littering the parking lot of his apartment building. The flyer was printed on thick black paper with white, almost handwritten lettering. One night only, a cinema experience unlike any other. Midnight showing at the Eclipse Theater. Admission free. Underneath was a simple address and nothing else. Dylan frowned. The Eclipse Theater? He'd lived in this city his whole life, but he'd never heard of it. The flyer was weird enough to pique his interest. He didn't have anything better to do and midnight was still hours away. By 11:30, curiosity got the better of him. The Eclipse Theater sat on the outskirts of the city, tucked away in an industrial district where old factories loomed like sleeping giants. It was surprisingly small, with a neon marquee that spelled out just two words, "Midnight Show." Dylan parked his car in the near-empty lot. There were only 3 other vehicles there, 2 older sedans and a van that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The ticket booth was empty but the door was unlocked. A faintly sweet, musty scent greeted him as he entered, like a mix of popcorn and something rotten. Inside it was like stepping into a time capsule. The Eclipse Theater was vintage, with plush red carpeting that muffled his footsteps and brass fixtures glinting under dim yellowed lights. The concession stand looked dusty, and the soda machine let out intermittent gurgles. There was no staff in sight. Just a handwritten sign above the counter. Snacks complimentary. Take what you want. Dylan grabbed a bag of popcorn, sealed, thank God, and a drink before heading into the single screening room. The theater itself was larger than he'd expected, but the screen was small, almost absurdly so given the size of the room. Faded red curtains framed it on either side, and only a few rows of plush high-backed seats occupied the space. 4 other people were already seated, each one spread out, almost deliberately distant from one another. There was an older couple near the front, a teenage boy a few rows back, and a man with a bowler hat seated dead center. As Dylan chose a seat near the aisle, the house lights dimmed. He glanced at his phone, 12 a.m. sharp. The movie began immediately, no trailers, no announcements. At first the film seemed ordinary. It was black and white, grainy with no opening credits. The scene was simple, a static shot of a room with no people, just a single chair in the center under a harsh spotlight. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Dylan shifted in his seat, already questioning his decision to come. Then, out of nowhere, a figure walked into the frame. A woman, dressed in what looked like an old maid's uniform, carrying a tray. She placed it on the chair and turned to stare directly at the camera. Her face, it was too clear, like she was staring through the screen at him. The theater seemed to grow colder. Over the next 20 minutes, the film followed the same pattern. A man entered the room next, dressed like a soldier. Then a young girl, skipping rope. They moved methodically, always placing something on the chair, a cup, a book, a cracked doll, and then they'd stop to stare at the screen. Dylan couldn't explain it, but their stares made his skin crawl. It was like they could see him sitting there, like they were aware of the audience in a way no actors ever should be. The couple in the front row whispered to each other, clearly uneasy. The man in the bowler hat sat as still as a statue, while the teenager kept nervously glancing behind him. The film continued. The people kept coming. A butcher dragging a heavy cleaver. A pale child with sunken cheeks. Their movements seemed slower now, more deliberate, and the objects they placed on the chair grew stranger, blood-stained rags, rusted tools, bones. Dylan's stomach churned. It didn't feel like a film anymore. It felt like a ritual. Then the screen flickered. For the first time, the perspective shifted, from the static shot of the room to a shot of the audience. Dylan froze. The grainy image on the screen showed the exact layout of the theater. His theater. The same seats, the same people. Himself included. Everyone else noticed too. The teenage boy gasped. The couple near the front stood up, visibly trembling. Is this some kind of prank? The man in the bowler hat asked, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. No one answered. On screen, the figure of the maid reappeared, holding a silver tray. This time, instead of placing the tray on the chair, she walked out of the room. Moments later, the theater door creaked open. Dylan's heart stopped. Slowly he turned to look. The maid was standing in the entrance, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She carried the same silver tray, her movements mirroring those on the screen. She took a step forward. The teenage boy screamed and bolted for the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic erupted. The older couple shouted, pounding on the walls. The bowler hat man stood up but didn't move. Dylan wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. On the screen the room began to change. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowered, and the spotlight on the chair grew dimmer. Figures began appearing in the shadows, watching silently. In the theater, the maid moved closer, her steps deliberate, her gaze unbroken. She stopped at the center of the aisle and placed the tray on the floor. It was empty. The lights in the theater flickered. When they stabilized, the screen showed only static. The maid was gone. So was the teenage boy. His seat sat empty, his popcorn spilled on the floor. The older couple shouted his name, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. Dylan's breath quickened. He stood, his eyes darting between the empty seat and the screen. The static shifted, forming an image. The boy, sitting in the same room from earlier, frozen like a mannequin. The bowler hat man bolted next, shoving past Dylan and sprinting toward the emergency exit. It too was locked. One by one, the lights in the theater began to fail, each bulb going out with a sharp pop. By the time the last light died, only the glow of the screen illuminated the room. On the screen, the audience was still visible. But now one more figure had joined them. Sitting in the back row, face obscured by shadows, was the teenage boy. And beside him, empty chairs began to fill, one by one, with the figures from the film. The maid. The soldier. The butcher. The last thing Dylan saw was his own reflection staring back at him from the screen. Then darkness swallowed everything. The next morning, the Eclipse Theater was gone. The building stood vacant, its doors padlocked, its windows dusty and cracked. No records of a screening existed. No flyer could be found. But occasionally, people swore they saw faint lights flickering inside at midnight, just long enough to make you wonder if the shadows watching from the windows were real.